The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard as guard Thomas Mitchell adjusted his red tunic for what felt like the 100th time that day. Standing perfectly still outside Buckingham Palace, he had mastered the art of becoming a living statue. Tourists gathered around him daily, trying everything from funny faces to loud noises, hoping to crack his stoic expression. Thomas had been doing this job for 3 years and nothing usually broke his concentration. But today was different. A small girl, no more than 6 years old, approached with her grandmother. Unlike other children who shouted or made silly gestures, she simply stood quietly beside him. Her tiny hand reached up and gently patted his gloved hand. "Thank you for keeping everyone safe," she whispered so softly that only he could hear. Thomas felt something stir inside his chest. The innocence in her voice, the genuine gratitude from someone so young, caught him completely off guard. His training screamed at him to remain motionless, but something deeper, more human, began to override his discipline. The little girl stepped back and gave him a small salute, copying what she had probably seen in movies. Her grandmother smiled warmly, clearly proud of her granddaughter's respectful gesture. Other tourists began to notice the touching scene, phones coming out to capture the moment. What happened next surprised everyone, including Thomas himself. Very slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the corner of his mouth began to twitch. Then, breaking every rule in his training manual, he returned the little girl's salute with a crisp, professional gesture. The crowd gasped audibly, cameras clicking frantically. But Thomas wasn't finished. He bent down slightly, still maintaining his rigid posture as much as possible, and whispered back to the girl, "And thank you for being so kind and respectful." The grandmother's eyes filled with tears as she watched her granddaughter beam with joy at being acknowledged by the guard. The moment lasted only 30 seconds, but the ripple effect was immediate. Other children in the crowd began approaching, more respectfully, inspired by what they had witnessed. Parents quieted their loud comments and began explaining to their children about the importance of the guard's duty. Thomas straightened back to his position, his face returning to its practiced, neutral expression. But inside, he felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the London sun. He had connected with another human being in the most unexpected way, proving that even in the most formal circumstances, genuine kindness could break through any barrier. As the family walked away, the little girl turned back one more time and waved. Thomas, fighting every instinct in his professional training, allowed himself the smallest nod in return. The crowd erupted in appreciative murmurs, understanding they had witnessed something truly special. The incident would be talked about for weeks among the other guards. Some would question Thomas's decision to break protocol, but most understood that sometimes being human matters more than following rules. The video of the exchange would eventually go viral, showing the world that beneath the ceremonial uniforms and stoic expressions were real people with real hearts. For the rest of his shift, Thomas found himself more aware of the individual faces in the crowd rather than seeing them as one anonymous mass. The little girl had reminded him why he chose this job in the first place, not just to stand guard, but to serve and protect people who deserved respect and kindness in return. The rain had been falling steadily for 2 hours, turning the usually bustling tourist area into a soggy mess of umbrellas and disappointed visitors. Guard Sarah Chen stood at her post outside Windsor Castle, water dripping from the brim of her bearskin hat despite the weather. Most tourists had sought shelter in nearby cafes, leaving the courtyard nearly empty except for the occasional hardy photographer. Sarah noticed movement near the castle walls and spotted an elderly man struggling with a heavy suitcase. He was clearly lost, squinting through rain-spotted glasses at a crumpled tourist map that was quickly becoming illegible in the downpour. The man appeared to be in his 70s, his thin jacket offering little protection against the British weather. Protocol dictated that Sarah remain at her post, eyes forward, ignoring distractions. But as she watched the man stumble slightly, under the weight of his luggage, her humanity overrode her training. The elderly gentleman reminded her of her own grandfather, and she could practically hear his labored breathing from across the courtyard. Without breaking her stance completely, Sarah began to angle her body slightly toward the struggling man. When he looked in her direction with desperate eyes, she did something that would have made her commanding officer furious. She made subtle eye contact and nodded toward the visitor information center nearby. The man understood her silent communication and began moving in that direction, but his suitcase caught on an uneven cobblestone, sending him stumbling forward. Sarah watched in horror as he lost his balance, certain he was about to fall hard onto the wet stones. In that split second, training gave way to instinct. Sarah broke from her position and quickly moved to steady the elderly man, catching his arm just as he began to fall. "Easy there, sir," she said quietly, helping him regain his footing. "Are you hurt?" The man looked up at her with grateful tears mixing with the raindrops on his cheeks. "Thank you so much, dear. I'm trying to find my way to the train station, but this weather—" He trailed off, clearly overwhelmed. Sarah glanced around quickly, knowing her sergeant could appear at any moment. But looking at this vulnerable man, she knew she couldn't just walk away. "The station is about a 10-minute walk that way," she said, pointing toward the main road. "But in this weather, you might want to call a taxi from the visitor center." "I don't know how to use these modern phones," the man admitted sheepishly, holding up an old flip phone. "My granddaughter usually helps me with these things." Without hesitation, Sarah pulled out her own phone and quickly called the local taxi service. "There's a taxi coming in 5 minutes," she told him. "Wait inside the visitor center where it's dry." The man's face lit up with relief and gratitude. "You're an angel," he said, pressing a worn business card into her hand. "I'm a World War II veteran, and I came here to pay my respects at the memorial. Young lady, you've restored my faith in the kindness of your generation." Sarah felt a lump form in her throat as she looked at the card. It identified him as Harold Morrison, Royal Navy, served 1943-1946. This man had literally fought for the very institution she now protected. "Thank you for your service, sir," she said, snapping to attention and giving him a sharp salute. "It's an honor." Harold straightened his shoulders and returned the salute with surprising crispness for his age. Other tourists who had been watching from doorways began to clap, understanding the significance of the moment. Sarah helped Harold with his suitcase to the visitor center just as the taxi arrived. As Harold climbed into the taxi, he rolled down the window. "What's your name, dear?" he asked. "Guard Chen, sir," she replied. "Well, Guard Chen, you've made this old sailor's day. God bless you." Sarah watched the taxi disappear into the rain, then returned to her post. Her uniform was soaked, and she would certainly face questions about leaving her position. But as she stood there, Harold's business card safely tucked in her pocket, she felt proud of her decision. Sometimes duty meant more than just standing still and looking impressive. Sometimes it meant remembering that the people you serve are individuals with their own stories, struggles, and dignity that deserves respect and protection. The afternoon shift change at the Tower of London was always a spectacle that drew crowds, but today felt different to guard Marcus Williams. As he took his position near the Crown Jewels entrance, he noticed a young couple arguing quietly near the barriers. The woman was clearly upset, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue while the man beside her looked frustrated and embarrassed. Marcus had excellent hearing, a skill developed through years of remaining alert while appearing motionless. He caught fragments of their conversation, something about a ruined proposal, a ring that wouldn't fit, and plans that had gone terribly wrong. The woman kept saying she didn't care about the ring, while the man seemed devastated that his carefully planned romantic gesture had backfired. The couple was from America, judging by their accents, and had clearly traveled a long way for this moment. The man had apparently chosen the Tower of London as the perfect backdrop for his proposal, but the ring he had custom-made was too small. In his nervousness, he had dropped it, and it had rolled through the metal grating of a storm drain. Marcus watched as the man got down on his hands and knees, trying desperately to see if he could retrieve the ring. Other tourists began to stare, some taking photos of what they thought was just another tourist making a fool of himself. The woman looked mortified by the attention they were drawing. Protocol demanded that Marcus remain focused on potential security threats, not tourist drama. But something about the genuine distress of this young couple moved him. He recognized the look of someone whose dreams were crashing down around them, and he remembered his own wedding day years ago. Making a decision that could cost him his job, Marcus slowly moved from his position. He approached the couple and, in a voice barely above a whisper, asked, "Excuse me, sir, but did you drop something valuable?" The man looked up, surprised to be addressed by one of the famously silent guards. "Yes, an engagement ring," he admitted, his voice cracking with emotion. "I've been planning this for months and now it's gone." Marcus knelt down beside the grating and pulled out a small flashlight from his kit. "Sometimes these drains aren't as deep as they look," he said, shining the light down into the darkness. "I can see something glinting about 2 feet down." Hope flickered in both their faces as Marcus assessed the situation. The grating was old, and one corner had worked loose over time. With some careful maneuvering, he managed to create just enough space to reach down with his long arm. A small crowd had gathered, watching this unusual scene unfold. Marcus stretched as far as he could, his face pressed against the cold metal grating. His fingers brushed against something small and round. "The ring. Got it," he said quietly, pulling his arm back up with the engagement ring safely in his palm. The crowd erupted in spontaneous applause as he handed the ring back to its owner. The young man stared at the ring in amazement, then looked at Marcus with tears in his eyes. "I can't believe you did that," he said. "You could get in trouble for helping us." Marcus straightened his uniform and prepared to return to his post. "Some things are more important than rules," he said simply. "Now, I believe you have something important to ask this young lady." The woman was already crying happy tears as her boyfriend took her hand. This time, the proposal went perfectly. She said yes, the ring fit beautifully, and the entire crowd cheered as they kissed. As Marcus returned to his position, tourists began approaching him differently. Instead of trying to make him laugh or break character, they showed genuine appreciation for what they had witnessed. Several people thanked him for his kindness, and one elderly gentleman shook his hand and said, "That's what real honor looks like." The couple approached Marcus before leaving, wanting to get a photo with the guard who had saved their engagement. Marcus agreed to one quick photo, breaking his stoic expression just long enough to offer a warm smile. Later that evening, the American couple would post their story on social media, praising the kindness of the British royal guard who went above and beyond his duty. The story would be shared thousands of times, with people commenting about how acts of unexpected kindness restore their faith in humanity. Marcus never saw the online reaction to his actions. He simply went home that night, knowing he had helped. Two people in love start their life together on a positive note, and sometimes that kind of human connection was worth any risk to his career. The medical emergency alarm echoed through St. James's Palace courtyard, just as guard David Park was beginning his afternoon shift. Through his peripheral vision, he could see paramedics rushing toward a commotion near the main gates. An elderly tourist had collapsed, and his wife was screaming for help in what sounded like German. David's training kicked in immediately, but not the kind related to standing perfectly still. Before joining the Royal Guards, he had been a paramedic for 5 years. The sounds of medical distress were impossible for him to ignore, no matter what uniform he wore or what post he was assigned to protect. The paramedics were struggling to communicate with the distressed German woman, who was too panicked to remember her English. She kept pointing at her husband and repeating words they couldn't understand. David could see the man was conscious, but clearly in severe pain, clutching his chest in the classic signs of a heart attack. Every fiber of David's being wanted to help, but leaving his post without permission was a serious breach of protocol. He watched as precious seconds ticked by while the paramedics tried to gather information from the frightened woman. Finally, his medical instincts overrode his military training. David stepped away from his position and approached the scene. "Excuse me," he said to the lead paramedic. "I speak German and I'm a trained medic. May I assist?" The paramedic looked surprised but nodded gratefully. David knelt beside the elderly woman and spoke to her in fluent German, his voice calm and reassuring. She immediately latched onto him, relief flooding her face at finally finding someone who could understand her. Through their conversation, David learned that her husband Heinrich had a history of heart problems and was taking specific medications. She had the medication list in her purse but was too shaken to remember where she had put it. David helped her locate it and translated, all the critical information for the paramedics. More importantly, David noticed something the paramedics had missed in the language barrier. The man wasn't just having a heart attack, he was also diabetic and showing signs of dangerously low blood sugar. The combination could be fatal if not addressed immediately. He's hypoglycemic too, David told the paramedics. His wife says he missed lunch and has been walking for hours. We need to check his glucose levels. The paramedics quickly confirmed David's assessment and began treating both conditions simultaneously. David continued to translate and comfort the woman, explaining each step of the treatment so she could understand what was happening to her husband. As they worked, a crowd of tourists gathered, many filming the unexpected scene of a royal guard providing medical assistance. David was completely focused on the emergency and didn't notice the attention until Heinrich's condition stabilized, and he was conscious enough to speak. The elderly German man reached out and grabbed David's hand, speaking in broken English. Danke. Thank you. You saved my life, he whispered. His wife was crying tears of relief and gratitude, repeatedly thanking David in both German and English. David stayed with the couple until the ambulance arrived, continuing to translate and provide reassurance. As Heinrich was loaded onto the stretcher, he insisted on shaking David's hand again. You are true soldier, he said. Not just uniform, true heart of soldier. After the ambulance left, David realized he had been away from his post for nearly 30 minutes. His commanding officer had arrived and was waiting with an expression that could have melted steel. David expected the worst possible consequences for abandoning his position, but something unexpected happened. The crowd of tourists who had witnessed everything began speaking up on David's behalf. They surrounded the commanding officer, all talking at once about how proud they were of the guard's actions and how it showed the true character of the British military. One tourist, a doctor from Canada, approached the officer directly. Sir, that guard just saved a man's life. His quick thinking and medical knowledge made all the difference. You should be proud of him, not angry. The commanding officer listened to multiple testimonies from witnesses, all praising David's professionalism and life-saving actions. Finally, he pulled David aside for a private conversation. You broke protocol, Guard Park, he said sternly. David prepared for disciplinary action, but you also saved a life and represented the finest values of our service. Sometimes being a good soldier means knowing when to break the rules for the right reasons. David felt a wave of relief wash over him. That evening, he received a commendation letter from Heinrich and his wife, written in careful English thanking him for his kindness and quick action. They had included a photo of themselves at their golden wedding anniversary the previous year, wanting him to know how much their continued life together meant to them. The incident became a training example for other guards about when humanitarian duties might override standard protocol, proving that the best soldiers are those who never forget they're human beings first. The autumn wind whipped through the grounds of Edinburgh Castle as guard Jennifer Scott took her position for the evening shift. The tourist crowds had thinned as daylight faded, leaving only a few dedicated visitors still exploring the ancient fortress. Jennifer had been stationed here for 2 years and thought she had seen every type of tourist imaginable. But tonight was different. A young boy, perhaps 8 years old, sat alone on a bench near the castle walls. He had been there for over an hour, and Jennifer noticed he kept checking an old-fashioned pocket watch and looking anxiously toward the main entrance. No adults seemed to be with him, which was highly unusual and concerning. Jennifer's training told her to alert security about the unaccompanied minor, but something about the boy's behavior made her pause. He wasn't crying or acting lost, like most separated children would. Instead, he sat with remarkable composure, clearly waiting for someone specific. As her shift progressed, Jennifer found herself glancing at the boy more frequently. He had pulled out a small notebook and was writing in it intently, occasionally looking up at the castle walls as if studying them. When other tourists passed by, he would politely nod but then return to his writing. Finally, as the castle prepared to close for the day, Jennifer made a decision. She couldn't leave her post entirely, but she positioned herself closer to where the boy was sitting. "Excuse me," she said quietly. "Are you waiting for someone?" The boy looked up with bright, intelligent eyes. "Yes, ma'am," he said in a crisp Scottish accent. "I'm waiting for my grandfather. He's a veteran and he served here many years ago. Today is the anniversary of his first day of service, and he wanted to come back one more time." Jennifer's heart softened at the boy's explanation. "What's your name?" she asked. "Jamie Morrison," he replied, closing his notebook carefully. "I'm writing down everything about the castle for my school project. My grandfather has been telling me stories about this place my whole life." The name Morrison rang a bell for Jennifer. She remembered hearing about a Harold Morrison who had served at Edinburgh Castle decades ago and had become something of a legend among the older guards. If this was his grandson, then the boy's patience and respect made perfect sense. "Your grandfather wouldn't happen to be Harold Morrison, would he?" Jennifer asked. Jamie's eyes widened with surprise. "You know my granddad?" Before Jennifer could answer, she spotted an elderly man making his way slowly up the castle approach, leaning heavily on a walking stick. Even from a distance, she could see the military bearing in his posture despite his obvious physical struggles. "Jamie," the man called out, his voice carrying across the courtyard. The boy jumped up and ran to meet his grandfather, who enveloped him in a warm embrace. Jennifer watched as Harold Morrison looked up at the castle walls with tears in his eyes. This was clearly an emotional pilgrimage for him. She could see him, pointing out different areas to Jamie, sharing stories that made the boy scribble furiously in his notebook. When they approached Jennifer's position, Harold stopped and studied her uniform with the keen eye of someone who understood military protocol. "You're doing a fine job, lass," he said simply. "Thank you, sir," Jennifer replied. "Your grandson has been waiting very patiently. He's a credit to you." Harold beamed with pride as he put his arm around Jamie's shoulders. He wanted to see where his old granddad learned to be a soldier. "I served here for 3 years in the 1960s. Best years of my life." Jennifer felt moved by the obvious bond between grandfather and grandson. On impulse, she made a decision that would have shocked her. "Commanding officers, would you like me to show you both around? I know some areas that aren't on the regular tour." Harold's eyes lit up with gratitude. "That would be wonderful, but I don't want to get you in trouble." "Some things are more important than regulations," Jennifer said, echoing words she had heard from other guards who had bent the rules for good reasons. For the next 30 minutes, Jennifer gave Harold and Jamie a private tour of areas usually restricted to staff. She showed them the guard quarters where Harold would have lived, the training grounds where he would have drilled, and the ceremonial halls where he would have stood duty. Harold shared stories with each location, bringing history to life for both Jamie and Jennifer. He told them about the camaraderie among the guards, the pride he felt in serving, and the lessons about honor and duty that had shaped his entire life. At one point, Harold asked Jennifer if he could take a photo of her with Jamie. "I want him to remember this day," he explained. Jennifer agreed, and the three of them posed together in front of the ancient castle walls. As the evening tour concluded, Harold shook Jennifer's hand with surprising firmness for his age. "Thank you for honoring an old soldier," he said. "You've made this day perfect." Jamie hugged Jennifer impulsively, then stepped back and gave her a smart salute that would have made any drill sergeant proud. "Thank you for taking care of Granddad's castle," he said solemnly. Jennifer returned the salute with equal seriousness. "It's an honor, Jamie. Take care of your grandfather." As they walked away together, Jennifer heard Jamie asking his grandfather dozens of questions about castle life and military service. She realized she had just witnessed the passing of values from one generation to the next, and she had been privileged to play a small part in that precious moment. The photo Harold took would become one of Jamie's most treasured possessions, representing the day he truly understood what his grandfather's service meant, and inspiring him to eventually follow in the family tradition of military service. The Christmas Eve snow fell softly around Horse Guards Parade as Guard Michael Thompson began what would be his most memorable shift ever. The usual crowds of tourists had dwindled to just a few hardy souls braving the winter weather to see the guards on this special evening. Most families were home preparing for Christmas morning, but Michael was proud to be serving his country even on this sacred night. Around 9 in the evening, When the area was nearly deserted, Michael noticed unusual activity near the entrance gates. A small group of people had gathered, but they weren't typical tourists. They were carrying sleeping bags, worn backpacks, and had the weathered look of people who spent their nights outdoors. Among them was an elderly man who immediately caught Michael's attention. Despite his obviously homeless condition, the man stood with perfect military posture and was organizing the small group with quiet authority. Something about his bearing suggested this wasn't just any street person seeking shelter. The elderly man approached the gates cautiously, clearly unsure if he would be welcome. "Excuse me, son," he called out to Michael in a voice roughened by years and weather. "I was wondering if you might know of any shelters still open this late. We have women and children with us, and the temperature is dropping." Michael studied the man more closely and noticed something that made his heart skip a beat. Barely visible beneath the man's tattered coat was a faded military medal on a worn ribbon. The man was a veteran, probably from decades past, now living on the streets. "What's your name, sir?" Michael asked, his voice carrying more warmth than protocol typically allowed. "Former Sergeant James Fletcher, Coldstream Guards, 1975 to 1995, the man replied, automatically straightening to attention despite his civilian clothes and circumstances. 20 years of service to the Crown. Michael felt a surge of respect and sadness. Here was a man who had served the same institution Michael now protected, yet had somehow fallen through society's cracks. The irony wasn't lost on him, a former guardian of the realm now seeking shelter from the cold. "Sergeant Fletcher," Michael said, using the man's former rank with intentional respect. "The main shelters are closed, but there's a church about 6 blocks north that usually opens its doors on Christmas Eve." James nodded gratefully, then hesitated. "Son, I know this is irregular, but would it be possible for us to wait here for just a few minutes? The youngest child with us is only 4 and she's exhausted. I just need to figure out our next move." Michael looked at the small group huddled near the gates. Along with James, there was a young woman with a toddler, an elderly woman who appeared ill, and 2 teenage boys who were trying to act tough but were clearly scared and cold. These weren't troublemakers or people looking to cause problems. They were simply human beings in need of basic shelter on the coldest night of the year. Breaking every rule in his manual, Michael made a decision that came straight from his heart. "Sergeant, there's a covered area just inside the courtyard that blocks the wind. It's not much, but it might help until you can get to the church." James looked stunned. "You would allow us inside? We don't want to cause you any trouble." "Sometimes duty means more than following orders," Michael replied, echoing the words of other guards who had chosen compassion over protocol. "Wait here." Michael quickly checked the area and confirmed no other security personnel were immediately nearby. He quietly opened a side gate and gestured for the group to enter. "Stay close to the building and keep quiet," he instructed. "I'll see what else I can do." Over the next hour, something extraordinary happened. Michael used his personal phone to call every contact he had, eventually reaching a volunteer coordinator who agreed to send a van to pick up the homeless group and take them to an emergency shelter that had just opened. While they waited, James shared his story with Michael. He had served with distinction for 2 decades but had struggled with post-traumatic stress after retirement. A series of personal tragedies, including the death of his wife and loss of his home to medical bills, had led him to the streets. Despite his circumstances, he had taken responsibility for protecting other vulnerable homeless individuals, especially women and children. "I may not wear the uniform anymore," James told Michael, "but I still believe in the oath to protect those who cannot protect themselves." Michael was moved by the former sergeant's dedication to others despite his own desperate situation. When the rescue van arrived, Michael did something that would become part of regimental legend. He removed his own warm scarf and wrapped it around the shivering toddler, then pressed some of his own money into James's hand. "This is from one soldier to another," Michael said quietly. "Merry Christmas, Sergeant Fletcher." James stood at attention one final time and rendered a perfect military salute to Michael. "Thank you, son. You've restored my faith that honor still exists in this world." As the van drove away, Michael returned to his post with a profound sense of purpose. He had risked his career to help fellow human beings on Christmas Eve, and it felt like the most important thing he had ever done in uniform. The next morning, Michael's commanding officer called him into the office. Michael prepared for disciplinary action, but instead found a letter waiting for him. James Fletcher had written to the officer, praising Michael's compassion and professionalism. The letter described how Michael's kindness had not only provided immediate help but had inspired James to seek proper assistance for his group. Rather than punishment, Michael received a commendation for exemplifying the highest values of military service. The incident became a reminder that true strength sometimes means knowing when to bend the rules in service of basic human dignity and compassion, especially during the season that celebrates hope and kindness toward all.